First, our environment, the world in which we live and work, is a mirror of our attitudes and expectations. That was Earl Nightingale. This is why we must ensure that we preserve our environment for future generations. In order to do so, we must halt hydraulic fracturing to take necessary measures to make sure it's safe for people, animals, and the ecosystem. It is because the world is a mirror of our attitudes and expectations that we stand in strong proposition that this House would halt all hydraulic fracturing. For today's debate, we propose the burden, creating the best world through economic benefit and safety. Our mechanism for this is the International Environmental Organization, which would work with states and other key stakeholders to help ensure that natural gas extraction does not come out of the expense of public health and the environment. The agency's focus and obligation would be to provide guidance and where appropriate, rulemaking that achieve the best possible protection of air, water, and land where people play and work. The agency would invest in improving our scientific understanding of hydraulic fracturing by conducting natural studies to understand the potential impacts of fracking. Go ahead.
Just clearing up, this agency is the Environmental Protection Agency.
It's the International Environmental Organization. So it's more coalitions than just the EPA. Now, to go on to the definitions debate, we propose the definition for halt. It's the position of movement or activity, typically a temporary one. Our next is hydraulic fracturing, which refers to the procedure of creating fractures in rocks and rock formations by injecting a mixture of sand and water into the cracks of force underground to open further. The larger fissures allow for oil and gas to flow out of the formation and into the wellbore, where we can call it to be extracted. Now, today I'm going to be discussing two very important parts: workers and the economy, and then contamination and water disposal. Felicia, my partner, will come up in the next speech to talk about the impacts on public infrastructure and services and air pollution and earthquakes. Now, on to my first point, workers and the health economy. A big problem here is that it will create health problems. Companies are not required to disclose the chemicals they use, or the formulas or the mixtures, or the process of them making it. That makes it difficult for local residents or first responders to prepare for an accident or emergency, and difficult for scientists to gauge the threat imposed by these chemicals. Therefore, we cannot just continue pumping these potential harmful chemicals into the earth we live. We have to take a step back and halt fracking until more public knowledge is presented. A 2011 article in the journal Human and Ecological Risk Assessment found that chemicals could affect the skin, eyes, and other sensory organs, and the respiratory and gastrointestinal systems, which would cause effects on the brain and nervous system. It could cause immune and cardiovascular systems, and even affect the kidney. These are all endocrine systems, and which could cause cancer or a mutation if it were to affect us. Now, our second point. The second problem with this point is the effects it has on the public. First, fracking pollution, it threatens the health of workers, nearby residents, and even people living far away. The chemical components of fracking fluids have been linked to cancer, endocrine distribution, and neurological and immune system problems, while oil and gas drilling produce water to the surface that can contain substances such as a volatile organic compound with potential impacts on human health. These are obviously very problematic in that it affects not only humans but the impacts around us. Those who live close to fracking sites can get sick from emissions from wells. A study from the Colorado School of Public Health documented an increased risk of illness for residents living within half a mile of natural gas wells in one area of Colorado due to air pollutants exposure. Studies near fracking sites in Texas, Pennsylvania, and Arkansas have detected components of natural gas and air in some cases. These are all things that are affecting us in the public, but none of us know about it. And it also will affect the economy. First, fracking puts pressures on housing supplies, thereby causing social dislocation. Government responds to increasing their spending on social works. Governments respond to increasing their spending on social services and subsidized housing. They will squeeze taxes, tax funding budgets, and workers at fracking sites face danger typical of other oils and gas workers, who are 7 times more likely to die on the job than other American workers. They also, however, face an additional threat of exposure to celiac sand, which is used for fracking process and can cause scoliosis. It not only affects the public around us, but it affects the people who are working in these sites as well. My second point is the contamination of water and waste disposal. First, there's the obvious question of an oil spill, which we all know is dramatic, In September of 2009, Cabot Oil and Gas spilled fracturing fluids twice at the company's Heismet gas well. The two incidents released a total of 8,000 gallons of the fracturing fluid, polluting Stevens Creek and resulting in a lot of fish killings. A third spill occurred a week later and did not enter the creek, thankfully. These spillings happen all the time with the fracturing, and according to the journalist at ProPublica, oil companies reported over 1,000 oil spills in North Dakota. In 2010, with many going unreported. This shows how dangerous it is to begin fracking in the first place, and how we can't even keep an eye on all of them especially. The public is unaware to most of these things. Also, methane gas and toxic chemicals leach out into the systems and contaminate water nearby. Methane concentrates are 17% higher in drinking water wells near fracturing sites than normal wells. There have been over 1,000 documented cases of water contamination next to areas of gas drilling, as well as the cases of sensory, respiratory, and neurological damage due to ingested contaminated water. Fracking can contaminate drinking water supplies in a variety of ways. It will spill and blow out on well pads, and failures of wastewater pits have released fracking chemicals and wastewater into nearby waters such as rivers, streams, and lakes. Poor well construction has enabled methane and other contaminants to foul groundwater supplies, and scientific studies have suggested that hydraulic fracturing over a period of time enables contamination for underground formulation targeted for oil and gas products to each groundwater supplies. Water contaminating also has a common result of fracking operations across the country. In New Mexico, there have been more than 400 instances in which materials of oil and gas waste pits leached into groundwater. Only 30 to 50% of the fracturing fluids is recovered. The rest of the toxic fluid is left in the ground and is not biodegradable. Also, there's a lot of harmful chemicals. Because fracking involves pumping of concoctions of water, sand, and chemicals into the ground to break apart the bedrock, environmentalists and private landowners worry that those chemicals could reach the poison in the groundwater. The companies are not required to disclose the chemicals they use, or the formulas or the mixtures in the process. That makes it difficult for the local residents and first responders to prepare the accident of emergency, and difficult to scientists to gauge the threat posed by the chemicals. Over 600 chemicals are used in fracking fluids, including carcinogens and toxins such as lead, uranium, mercury, methanol, hydraulic acid, and other terrible chemicals. To end my speech, I'm going to repeat our team line. It is because the world is a mirror of our attitudes and expectations that we stand in strong proposition that the House would halt hydraulic fracking.
The human population is growing at an exponential rate. There are more people living on this earth in this generation than any generation before us. Each one of these 7 people, despite their vast differences, have one very important thing in common. They all need energy. Today, scientists are working tirelessly to sustain the energy needs of an ever-growing world. One solution they found is natural gas through hydraulic fracturing. Though some criticize the fracking process, we believe overall fracking is the best option for sustainable, cost-efficient, safe energy. Thus, because we believe that to deny fracking is to deny innovation, we stand in the firm proposition to the motion we would halt all hydraulic fracturing. Including burden the proposition provides, then, in today's round, the opposition does not strive to tell you fracking is perfect, no energy sources. We are just here to prove that hydraulic fracking is a better, safer, and more economically sound alternative to many other types of fracking. Announce the split. First, political benefits of fracking and the economic benefits. Second, the environmental impact. Contention 1, political benefits. Currently, there's a heavy fluctuation in oil market. Spread of ISS as the Middle East has led to capturing of all oil reserves. ISIS undercuts major oil exporters by a fraction of their costs, which causes them to ramp up their prices for the buyers who won't exchange with ISIS. Many countries are affected by this, as the majority of exported oil is held by a handful of countries. Fracking can be built up domestically and improve that country's local economy. By allowing fracking to prosper, we inherently diminish our dependence on foreign oil, and it allows for economic stability. Contention 2, the economic benefits. Increased value. The direct benefit of increasing oil and gas production includes the value of increased production attributable to the technology. In 2001, the USA produced 8 million cubic feet of natural gas from shale gas wells, taking an average price of $4.24 per thousand cubic feet. That's a value of $36 billion due to shale gas alone. Increased employment. This increase in value produced can be increased the number of people employed directly in production and delivery activities. These numbers will often be pointed to in political debates. In an economy with full employment, such an increase would not be considered a benefit per se. But a state such as New York, with a high unemployment rate of 8.2, might wish to weigh the potential employment effects when evaluating the merits of a moratorium. At its peak in 1980, the oil and gas extraction sector supported 267,000 employees, according to the data from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. As more easily tapped oil reserves grew scarcer and domestic oil production gradually declined over 2 decades.
For the thing you just said about the higher employment rate of being 8.2, do you have the percentage of those that actually get harmed from doing that production?
It's substantially lower. So,
You gave New York as an example for the like shale gas thing, right? So
yes.
is there any evidence that like New York specifically has like good fracking or good oil within the community, or would those people need to like migrate to a state that does?
We're reviewing this review by not every specific. With the numbers of employees in oil and gas extraction shrinking by over 50% to 118,000 in 2003. Since 2000, however, there has been a steady upward climb in employment, slowing only slightly during 2009 and reaching 198,000 by December 2012, over a 67% increase. As other industries have sputtered in an math of 2008 recession, oil and gas has been a remarkably bright spot in the U.S. economy, with employment at the end of 2012 at its highest since 1987. Increased trade. There is also direct effects of this production on the trade balance. The increase in oil and natural gas extraction has directly impacted the energy trade balance between the USA and other countries. Natural gas imports decreased by 25% between 2007 and 2011, while petroleum imports dropped from a high of 28 quadrillion BTU in 2005 to 24 in 2011. By 2020, the Energy Information Administration predicts that the USA will become a net exporter of natural gas, and as more natural gas reserves are discovered and tapped, that date may yet be pushed earlier. And my partner will go on to state our contention through the environmental impacts.
The world is a mirror of our attitudes and expectations because the proposition firmly believes us that we believe that there should be a halt on hydraulic fracking. Let's go over a little bit of the framework argument. In order to win today's round, the side that wins must prove that the world is overall more beneficial either with fracking or without fracking. And we're here to prove today that a world without fracking is overall a beneficial, greater world. The second thing you have to look to is the word halt in the resolution. Not stating that we should never ever have hydraulic fracking, that a temporarily halt, which is part of the definition of the word halt, is actually going to be beneficial because we're going to temporarily stop fracking, find some of the harms and be able to solve for it, then continue fracking. Nowhere in the proposition case are we advocating for a total elimination of fracking, just a temporary halt to make sure that fracking is safer for everybody. Now let's go on to the opposition case. The first thing that they're talking about is political benefits, and they're talking about the fact that ISIS has control of oil. There's a couple of problems with this argument. The first problem with this argument is they don't actually tell you how much money ISIS is actually making off this oil and how many parts of the United States it's actually looking to. Secondly, they don't tell you that pen doesn't work. Secondly, they're not actually telling you they're just saying that it's bad that ISIS has oil and we're able to get energy through hydraulic fracking in the United States, but they're not considering different alternative methods that have been proven safer in the United States, such as solar and wind energy. These proven safer methods, because they've been developed longer and they don't have the crazy consequences that hydraulic fracking has, are overall going to be more beneficial, but still stop everything in their first contention about political benefits. So by doing alternatives or having this temporary halt to learn more about hydraulic fracking, we're going to encompass all of the same arguments that they do through political benefits. Yes?
So we're aware that solar and wind both have costly economic default, so how are we going to implement all this funding into solar and wind energy?
Okay, there's a couple problems. We are going to first of all be able to, because we can see the more widespread implementation of solar and wind energy in the present. And secondly, we're overall looking to create the best possible world. And if we can have a safer, more efficient energy source, even if it takes more money, then we're going to see that's overall more beneficial world. Now going on to their second point about production. First of all, they're talking about the amount of employment that's actually gained from hydraulic fracking. But there's a couple of main problems with this. Look to our 2011 journal about the actual effects of employees on hydraulic fracking plants. They are more likely to have skin harms, irritation, and sicknesses such as cancer during their lifetime if they're actually working at hydraulic fracking. If we're looking at the best way to benefit all people, yes.
The specific instances of error in fracking implementation, in those cases, in the select cases, do those countries abide by the regulations that they're bound to?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
In the cases you're citing, like the cherry-picked cases, are those companies abiding by the regulations that they're bound to?
Okay, first of all, they're not cherry-picked cases. We're showing you multiple studies where they have the ability to, where people have cancer. We're showing you a 2010 journal, and we're telling you a 2011 journal where people are more likely to increase. Secondly, like the whole problem with fracking is they don't actually have to publish what's actually coming from fracking. They don't have to publish the amount of toxic chemicals. So the very problem is that there isn't strict enough regulations, which is why we would have a temporary halt to see the kind of regulations they need to overall be more beneficial. Now going back to their second point when they're talking about production and employment, other than the overall health risk, overall what my partner said in the other examination, there's no guarantee that these jobs are going to go to everybody, only in areas where hydraulic fracking is actually applicable. So almost like they're just saying that there's going to be this possibility for all of these jobs, for all of these people, but hydraulic fracking isn't even possible everywhere, so there's no reason it's going to create this mass employment. The next they're talking about like the natural gas, there's a decrease in need for natural gas from other places, which is like not a substantial impact. You're just saying that we produce natural gas so we don't have to get it from other places, which is an obvious, no thank you, which is obvious like from the resolution in and of itself. But they're not actually talking to you in this contention about why that's a good thing. They're just saying that we just have a less of a dependence on getting natural gas from other countries. They're not showing you, other than saying that there's theoretically more jobs, why this actual dependence is actually good. The next thing you're talking about is the date may be pushed back for a hydraulic fracturing, but this is actually a good thing. If the date is pushed back and we actually have proper examinations of hydraulic fracturing, we're going to have a more likely instance to actually examine the fracturing and make it beneficial overall. Now going on to our third point, which is the impacts on public infrastructure and services. Our first point under this is that it interferes with the individuals or citizens. Going on to our first point, transportation of water is being forced for fracturing. It's important to note that when you lay down a road of fracturing, while you are laying down a road for a big heavy truck that tears up the roads on the way down from the fracturing sites. However, when you lay down a road or a portal system, you're not tearing up the road because of the billions of gallons of water is not necessary. 2, the trucks required to deliver water to a single fracking well cause as much as damage to the road as 3.5 million car journeys, putting massive stress on the roadways not constructed to handle such heavy volumes of traffic. Basically saying that the infrastructure right now is not actually capable of large-scale fracturing or fracking, so it's going to be worse for the economy overall. Going on to the next thing is that one county in Texas projected that fracking will consume 40% of its water by 2020, and such increases may lead to calls for increased public investment in infrastructure. A new state water plan in Texas, for instance, calls for $53 billion public investment in the water system, including $400 billion for needs in the mining sector, including fracking. Fracking also strains public services, increases heavy vehicular traffic, and has contributed to an increased traffic accidents in drilling regions. At the same time, the influx of temporary workers that typically accompanies the fracturing puts pressure on housing supplies, thereby causing social dislocation. Governments respond by increasing their spending on social services and subsidized housing, squeezing tax-funded budgets. This is according to the environmentcolorado.org. The well's location where drilling takes place is only 1 million of the act, and since the well can require up to 8 million gallons of water and up to 40,000 gallons of chemicals, a site may need up to 2,000 tanker trucks per frac. A well can be fracked up to 20 times. This is bad not only for overall ecosystem because it's not only hurting the people, but it's also hurting aquatic freshwater resources, polluting the air quality and created roads that need repair issues. The second thing we're going to talk about is the fact that it strains infrastructure and public services and imposes cleanup costs that can fall on the taxpayers. The state of Texas has approved $40 million in funding for road repairs in the Burnett Shale region, while Pennsylvania estimated in 2010 that $265 million would be needed to repair damaged roads in the Marcus Shale region. And going on to our last point is that it increases the demand for new water construction. Texas's state water plan calls for an expenditure of $40 million on projections to support the mining sector over the next 50 years. Going on to our final point, which is the air pollution and earthquakes. Overall, the first idea in this is air pollution. Methane is a main component of natural gas and is 25% more potent than trapping heat into the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or the NOAA, estimated that 4% of methane produced by these wells is escaping the atmosphere. China has found that the welled country gas is the equal of carbon emissions of 1 to 3 million cars. This is because fracking water is disposed poorly. The waste flows is left in the open air to pits to evaporate, releasing harmful VOCs or vital organic compounds into the atmosphere, creating contaminated air, acid rain, and ground level ozone. All of these further contaminating the air for the people and for the other organisms living in the environment, thus showing it's not beneficial. The air contaminants are released through drilling procedures, construction, and operation of wells. Released pollutants that cause short-term illnesses, cancer, organ damage, and nervous system disorders. Crystalline silica in the form of sand can cause celluloses, an incurable but preventable lung disease when inhaled by coworkers. All of this leads to the fact that hydraulic fracturing is not currently up to date. We need to look to make it better, and this can only be done with a temporary halt. So because we believe the world is a mirror of our attitudes and expectation, we stand in the firm proposition.
Two important observations before even getting into side proposition's case. First, status quo. When determining the outcome of this round, you have to look toward which world is better. Is it a proposition world where you're completely halting fracking, or is it an opposition world where we don't completely halt it, but reform it to accommodate certain discrepancies in the status quo? Which world is better? That's going to be the determining factor in this round, and that should be a critical voter issue. But the second observation is going to be real world, the second observation is going to look toward how we should look toward realistic scenarios. Meaning, yes, ideally it would be great if we could employ all of these alternative energy sources and all of these alternatives that don't have detrimental effects to the environment, but we have to look at what's best in the status quo and what is actually realistically applicable. Those two should be the two biggest determinants of the winner of this round. With that in mind, let's go into their framework. So side proposition starts in their first speech. They talk about how it's going to be regulated by the IEO, the International Environmental Organization. But the biggest issue with that is going to look for the second observation that I made to you, saying that we should look toward real world or realistic scenarios. And in this realistic scenario, in what's going on now, you could look at the majority of chair members of the IEO. Yes.
Wait, are you aware that the IEO wouldn't actually be implementing anything? They would be creating regulations in order which other countries to follow, implemented through their own government.
Absolutely. All right, so looking back at the IEO, what you're going to notice is that 16 of the world's largest oil producers, shale oil producers, in fact employ fracking. Having these chair members be bound to alter their entire oil economies because of one international environmental organization isn't going to happen. It's not going to happen, it's not realistic, and you can't take their mechanism at the point where it's not going to happen. Yes?
You talk a lot about economic benefit. Is it rather harmful or helpful that we have to pay for the damages done by hydraulic fracking?
Well, if you're asking about the economic benefit, I would argue that one, it increases consumerism, and two, it's better for the producer.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, with that in mind, you're going to be noticing that their mechanism doesn't work. The IEO isn't a functional mechanism because its chair members aren't going to cooperate with this heightened regulation. But look at their first argument. They talk about work and the economy, and they talk about these health problems and the effects on the public. The first argument I would argue against that is first, again, yes, I can see that some areas, some instances which they mention do in fact involve certain contaminations or health problems arising. But I would contend to you that this is a result of countries loosely abiding by the regulations bound to them. If you look at regulations in place, what the New York Times tells you is that the federal rules in most scenarios for fracking in place are violated. If we had a stronger enforcer for how to regulate fracking, you wouldn't experience these discrepancies. And as a result, side proposition drops because they are contending to you that we should halt it completely. What the opposition tells you is there's no need to halt it, merely alter it to accommodate these discrepancies so they don't happen. So when you look at the health problems and you look at the contamination that they talk about in their second point, I ask you to look to the EPA study from June of this year that tells you that they find no contamination when fracking happens in a regulated manner. When fracking occurs, there is no proven contamination, and that's coming directly from the largest environmental entity in the globe. But if you look at their third argument, they talk about impacts on the public. Yes.
Can you give me your definition of halting?
To stop completely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so again, with the second contention on contamination, I'm essentially going to ask you to look toward the most reliable, toward the most credible environmental warrant, the Environmental Protection Agency, and by their argument when they tell you not a year ago that there is no proven contamination as a result of fracking. Move to their third argument, they talk about impacts on the public. And they talk about a lot. They talk about the environmental impacts as well as the economic impacts. At that point, I ask you to look toward the Journal on Policy Analysis in New Energy. And what they tell you is that when this happens, or is that compared to, in the status quo, compared to oil drilling or alternative energy, fracking is the ideal route to go in terms of energy production. And what we see there is that not only as a result in terms of the economy is increased consumerism by 40%, Fracking enables more people, or if you look at like the increase in demand, again, this is going to link toward the first observation I made to you at the beginning of my speech. Look at the status quo. Look at what's happening now. What we see in America, in our own country, is that the demand for energy is on the rise. The population is rising, and with it, the need for energy. And the only way to sustain this rising need and to sustain the increased consumerism as a result is fracking. There's no alternative, and that's what the Journal on Practical Investment Analysis tells you. But what you also see in terms of the impacts on the public is that, again, if you buy the side opposition argument that you don't need to halt it completely, merely reform the regulations, you can see better benefits. But with that in mind, let's look at the third contention on side opposition. And this is going to link into a lot of the arguments made by side proposition in their last speech. So the third argument side opposition wants to make deals with the environmental impacts, primarily water safety. What we see is that a 4-year meta-analysis conducted by the EPA finds that contamination of water is not present. The EPA notes that at least 25,000 to 30,000 new fracking sites have been created since 2011, and they've noted no discrepancies since their formation. But we also see this in the form of wind and solar. And here I ask you to comparatively analyze fracking with other status quo methods of energy extraction: oil drilling, wind and solar power. And what we find here is that less infrastructure is required when compared to these alternatives. This is going to make fracking the ideal form of energy extraction. Some of the impacts of solar power are actually relatively high, so it's not a complete surprise that shale gas is better in a few cases, especially through fracking. This is mainly because manufacturing solar panels is very energy and resource intensive, while their electrical output is quite low. So if you want an efficient manner of extracting energy, if you want one that actually yields results to sustain the rising demand for energy, that's going to be fracking. We tell you right here that wind and solar aren't going to be working. So when the second proposition speaker stood up here in her last speech and tried combating our first point on politics by telling you that we need to consider alternatives, I tell you don't consider alternatives because warrants already have, and they've told you that fracking is actually better. And at that point, you have to prefer fracking. So again, the two biggest observations that should be determining the judge's vote are status quo and realistic applicability. Status quo, what we see in the status quo is that side opposition is winning for a couple of reasons. One, we're telling you that to sustain the current rising need of energy demand, the only way to do this is through fracking. And we're winning on realistic applicability because these other methods aren't sustainable and they're not cost efficient. When they talk about, yes, wind and solar would be nicer. Yeah, they would be nicer, but they're not realistic. And at the point where fracking is the most cost-efficient manner of yielding this energy and better for the general populace, and at the point where their mechanism is no longer valid because the majority of oil-producing entities actually employ fracking and aren't going to cooperate with these heightened regulations, you must vote side opposition. So it is because to deny fracking is to deny innovation that I'm very proud to stand on side opposition. Thank you.
Can we begin? Cool. Okay. So first we would like to begin off talking about how we are preserving our environment for our future generations. So let's go back off our main point in this debate. It's because the world is a mirror of our own attitudes and expectation that we stand a strong proposition that we have to halt fracking. Now, two observations that our opponents talked about was the status quo and realistics. So let's bring up what's happening in the status quo of today and what we really want to bring up in realism. Currently, as we stated before, in our case, that chemicals being used aren't safe and fracking are actually posing a threat. And that's why we talk about our point on workers and economy and the impact on infrastructure. First of all, we said that halting, one is temporary for the definition of halt. So that's the problem we have in this debate, the definition of halt. Halting, as one of the opposition stated, that we have to stop it immediately. Our halting on our side is temporarily we're using so that we can reform it. Now, we've already stated how it's affecting the eyes and the skin. It's affecting the brain and it's also affecting kidneys. By doing hydraulic fracturing, we're actually letting carcinogens, which causes cancer, be put in the air. On our big impact on the public, we already stated how water contains substances on the human health, how it causes people to get sick, and in Colorado, there has been a big air pollution exposure. It's also been said that in Colorado, there was a big deficit in the water where over 1,000 aquatic life died because of hydraulic fracturing. We're talking about the economy, how increasing money on subsidizing has always has workers dying of today, yes.
Can you specify what specific contaminants we're dealing with?
So being that hydraulic fracturing were put into the ground, it actually causes all this bad chemicals out of the ground to be put in that water, thus killing those 1,000 aquatic lives. Okay. Going back off what I was saying about the fracturing process causing disorders. So like we saying again, there's more and more oil spills. There's being a lot of people polluting. There's people polluting. The air is being polluted, and there's a lot of people dying. There's being methane gas and its concentration, and it's contaminating the water. We also want to go back off of New Mexico and how its waste has been contaminated into underground water, thus contaminating the water that they use to drink. We need to go back on the public work and infrastructure, which it causes already a lot of stress to roads, and it also strains public services. Yes.
Yeah, so again, these issues that you're talking about, contamination, are these instances where the company is actually complying with the regulations?
Well, the thing I think you're forgetting that we already put in our case was that being that these companies don't actually have to disclose the chemicals that they're putting that's coming from fracking, that's the real problem. It's not because the company is loose, the company is too loose, but it's the point of that they're not having to disclose what's actually being, the chemicals that actually being put. Now, going off from my other, my opponent's case, how they talk about, it's, they already agreed that some areas have some discrepancies. And that's what we're saying. They want to say that's because of loose control, like we stated before, and we're going to state it again. It's not because of loose control, but it's stated from the fact that they don't have to disclose what's the chemicals being used. When they want to talk about the status quo, that is the status quo right there. People and the community dying because people do not disclose what the chemicals and the harmful things that be put in the air. They never want to deny our point about how water contamination and how the air is being polluted. That's another thing they've got to talk about. They've got to talk about oil spill. They bring up the point of and increasing jobs. The point about that is we've already stated how people who are doing hydraulic fracturing are actually dying. So we're not increasing jobs, we're actually putting in places of people that's dying, thus taking money more from the government spending because you have to buy stuff and fix problems that are being done from hydraulic fracturing. They also stated, they talked about how we have, it's also increased our trade with other nations. And the UN Charter states that we have a responsibility to protect the people. And that's our main thing. That's what we're saying from stopping hydraulic fracturing. And we make sure that these chemicals do not harm the people. That is the main thing that nations will want to agree with us. Not doing this to gain money, but doing this to save the life of the people. And that's what we want to mainly focus on. They keep talking about how it's an economic benefit. And we've shown time and time again that there's no economic benefit. We're using millions of dollars having to fix what hydraulic fracturing is actually causing. We have to go back how they talked about that politically wise it would be good, and that they talk and one of the PLRs they talked about solar and wind. This is based on the environment. So this is place-based wise. Some people can use solar powers while some other places can't. Some places can use wind solar while some other places can. And this is a state by state or place by place basis. So we cannot say that all solar and wind is bad for all places. Like we said again, it's based by base. And like we want to keep continuing that what we're basing this on is the environment and what's better for the people. And being that they gave no references on the people who are actually getting hurt, this is a problem. We cannot just talk about what the benefits are. We have to also notice that there are some defects to this. And being that we're saying that we want to halt it, like they've already stated, they said on their side they want to reform it. That's what halting is doing. Halting is temporarily stopping it so we can reform it so it can be better. So something that we need to stress again is that we're not actually stopping hydraulic fracturing. We're just stopping it enough for the time so we can reform it and get it better so we can use it more efficiently and not have to spend so much money. They had no framework at all. We time and time again presented a framework, something that they did not show up for. So that's also another downfall for what they're doing. They have we already stated how we must prove the world to be overall more beneficial and we halt hydraulic fracturing. And like I said again, we've already proven that with the carcinogens being put in the air, with all the water contamination. We're already in a crisis where we need a lot of water. We can't be giving dirty water to people and then killing them off. So the thing about that is we can't continue hydraulic fracturing them if we're going to be giving out dirty water. They talk about percentage of oil and how ice has too much oil. And we're not saying anything about the oil. All we're saying is we want to prevent it to make it better. A lot of places has oil. Currently right now, Russia and the U.S. are fighting over places in Alaska because they're trying to drill oil from some of the hot spots in Alaska. So ISIS isn't the only place to have oil. Yes, they have oil, but they have not stated the percentage of oil they have or how much of the oil that they have actually cost. Another thing is that they don't talk about the downfall of these. They talk about the 6-7% of the increase and the recession of people in jobs. And we're not saying that there never was a recession. We're saying that more people are dying from jobs than actually not being able to get jobs. They talk about independency. We're not saying that we're taking away anybody's independence. What we're saying is we're better preserving the lives of the people. And that's what our main overall goal is, to ensure that the future generations of the world will not have to stand by and watch idly people die because we're being too careless with our hydraulic fracturing. We're making sure that anything we do, we'll preserve the lives of the people without trying to gain a beneficial goal, because our beneficial goal is to what? Preserve the people. Our social contract says that the rights of the government derive from people. If our government cannot make sure that the people today are actually safe and assured, how can we ensure a safe government in a safe country? If we cannot let our people be okay, we cannot ensure that anything in this world will be okay. And that's why we must have to say, they never talked about our point of earthquakes and how big of the earthquake outcome has been. They're actually taking some of our points and trying to twist it to make it seem bad, when in reality they're not actually negating our case to its full potential. They're just using what they would like to use to make it sound bad. And at this point in time, that is actually wrong. So to go back off of what we're saying, we're preserving our environment for future generations. We're making sure that it's because the world is a mirror of our attitudes and expectations, that we stand in strong proposition that we have to halt hydraulic fracking. Thank you.
So my opponent continuously goes over about how the environment gets harmed through the chemicals and everything like that, and how that the people that are fracking don't have rules that have to say that they give out the information of what chemicals are being used or how they're doing and everything. All we have to do is set certain regulations. We don't have to completely halt everything and bring it to a stop to make new rules. Just because it's broken doesn't mean we have to throw it away. We can fix it while keeping it going. Because all you have to do is create the rule and create the regulation of having to release the chemical information and everything like that. And studies show that as long as they follow the set of regulations that there are now, no chemical harm or no harm has actually been proven. EPA states that there are no proven contaminants within the water or the air or anything like that, as our opponents continuously say. And this is due to fact that they can potentially not be following the exact regulations that they should be. They'll be loosely following it, which is bad. Yeah.
Is a company more likely to implement regulations if the regulations itself are necessary in order for them to start fracking again? Or are they more likely to just listen to regulations because they want to?
They would have to listen to regulations in order to keep everything safe. And it's like following rules. They have to follow rules in order to keep things going. And then this also combats with terrorism in the sense that ISIS has a very large control over a lot of oil preserves out in the Middle East, which is where a large amount of people go to and try to get the profits of oil. And they try to pay for oil and get it through there. And with fracturing, it increases the amount of oil and it will better benefit in the long run. Yeah?
Who's currently buying the oil from ISIS?
Multiple countries. Turkey and black market.
Thank you.
Are you saying that fracking in the status quo is what's solving for like the ISIS threat?
Not necessarily the ISIS threat, but it helps combat it with the oil. Producing more oil will allow us to combat them by selling it for less, and they will have to have issues with gaining money in a sense. And then, so overall, the environment is better protected through fracking because, as my opponent continuously says, that it damages it. It doesn't, and then if you go to the other, it's the better alternative, because if you go to, say, wind power or solar, it's the better alternative because solar panels cost a lot more, as my partner had just stated, that it costs more to produce, and it gives very less emissions, and doesn't produce as much energy as, say, fracking would. Yeah?
You say it's the better alternative. What's going to happen when all of the natural gas or oil that we're fracking runs out?
Then you'll have to fall back onto better made
So,
better made alternatives. But right now in the state, in the sense, the cost is really high in the sense that like making a solar panel is going to cost more than the actual energy that is produced. And with fracking now, and we still have these natural gases and the energy that we can use in the oils, we might as well use them to our advantage and get the most out of it, while we come up with better ways to make better alternatives. Then I'm gonna use impact calculus, and we're gonna look at the pros and cons of, not the pros and cons, the prop and op, and why we went on the economy argument and politics and arguments and stuff like that. So, as I stated before, the prop argues that the environment is harmed because the water is polluted and stuff like that, but through the EPA, it states that it's proven that there's no contaminants within the actual following regulations of the basic rules of fracking, and we benefit the economy more than they do because they just use the arguments that it damages the roads and that's going to cost a lot of taxpayers' money. But we produce, through fracking, you can produce a lot more money and create jobs and create a larger amount of oil, which can go to help repair these roads if that's the real big deal that they're trying to issue on. Yes?
Does public safety have a big influence on the economy?
Public safety on the economy?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I think my opponent was just trying to state that public safety is being harmed through fracking because of the arguments through contaminants in the air and everything. And as I've stated before, through the regulations, as long as you follow the rules that have been stated, there are no contaminants, like no really harmful contaminants that come from it. And through the politics argument, we win this because we help stop the terrorism of them getting money and through the oil, as I've stated before. So these points that we create jobs, gain more oil, and we gain more money. And then politics, we stop the terrorism and the issues that fall within that. And then within the environment, we have less emissions through fracking. It's the better alternative, and the water has no contaminants in it, as our opponents continuously say. To deny fracking is to deny innovation.
Judges, again, I ask you to look toward the two key observations that should inevitably be determining your decision. First, weigh it off of the status quo. What is better for the status quo? And second, weigh off of what is most realistic, what can actually happen, and as a result, can better fulfill the need in the status quo. With that, let's look at what side proposition has told you today. They depicted you this fantasy Candyland world in which we can do alternative energy, we can have solar panels everywhere to combat the need of energy, and we wouldn't suffer in the slightest. Also, that this is going to be regulated under the IEO. I told you two things. One, that alternative energy is a great idea, but in the status quo, what's happening right now isn't sustainable to the scale needed by the need of energy. But second, I also told you that in the status quo, we need it for things like ISIS, which my partners have repeatedly told you. To combat ISIS, no, we're not saying it's the sole motivator behind the demise of ISIS, but we're telling you that if we pursue this, we can also combat ISIS by taking away from the largest chunk of the market that produces ISIS's revenue, and as a result, hurt them where it hurts. So, to deny fracking is to deny innovation, and by the end of this speech, you will see just that. Look at what side proposition has told you today. We're going to be doing some comparative analysis. So we see two common similarities in both cases. That's going to be arguments on environment and on economy. So let's start off on economy. What has side proposition told you in terms of the economy? The thing they spent the most time on was that it's going to detract from taxpayer funds because big trucks create big messes on infrastructure. I would tell you that there's no correlation, but even if you bought it as an argument, I would tell you that side opposition already outweighs. If you took this impact of trucks damaging the infrastructure of the places where fracking exists, I would tell you that it's clearly outweighed by the economic benefits brought to you on side opposition. We show you economic benefits in the form of increased employment. Side opposition is literally a job creator. We show you that we increase the value of oil, helping the global economy, and we show you that we're seeing increased consumerism. All of these, if you took one of these three economic impacts, a single one would outweigh this taxpayer impact that they try to tell you. But look at the environmental arms. The biggest warrant you're going to be looking toward this is, again, the Environmental Protection Agency, who concludes after a 4-year meta-analysis that there is no proven contamination. This is again going to bring us to the argument, the feud between opposition and proposition on what halt means. At the point where we tell you in our first speech that halting is to stop completely, they need to tell you why this is a good thing. And at the point where they can't, at the point where we're telling you that in the status quo, about 40% of shale oil consumption happens as a result of fracking, stopping it completely would have detrimental effects to the global economy. You can't just stop it for hiatus and try and fix it. If it's broken, that doesn't mean throw it away. We contend to you that we can implement these reforms in a reasonable, realistic manner and not have to halt it completely, because inevitably it would lead to these huge detrimental impacts. But then we can look toward the only political impact left standing on either side, and that's going to be the counter to terrorism on-side proposition. So in terms of impact calculus, which is what my last speaker just told you, we're winning on environment because we're telling you that there is no proven contamination. Even if you look at the small instances they talk about, it's solely due to the lack of abiding by the regulations which side opposition seeks to solve for. We tell you that there's no proven contamination when these regulations are in place. You can take this earthquake argument, but at the point where they're not showing you a direct link between drilling in general and fracking, don't buy it. So vote on economy, vote on environment, and vote on politics. To deny fracking is to deny innovation, and for those reasons, I'm very proud to stand on side opposition.
The world is a mirror of our attitudes and expectations. When looking at this quote, there's a couple main things we need to look at before getting into the proposition's winning arguments. First, we need to look at the framework in today's debate, talking about whose world is the most beneficial. And unless we can prove that a world is beneficial, not just economically like the opposition seems to think, but overall creating the best world not only for the present, but also sustainably for the future by having a good quality of life for the people and the environment. The next thing that they talk about is the realistic argument, but let's go back to the POI I made, talking about what's more likely. Having companies have temporarily halt, and then the only way that they're actually able to begin fracking again is if they meet the environmental regulations, or just hoping that one day that they'll meet the environmental regulations because they want them to. A halt is more realistic because it's actually more motivational for companies to meet environmental regulations, and that's going to be one of the reasons you're going to have to vote in the proposition. But also the definition of the word halt. Halt means a temporarily stop. All of these alternative energy sources that we're talking about are just going to be temporarily until we can make hydraulic fracking safe for the environment. Then let's look at the two main reasons we're going to win this round, and it's going to be economically and environmentally. Looking at economically, let's talk about infrastructure. They just say that infrastructure doesn't matter, but in Texas alone, $400 million would be used for just roads in Texas, which is a giant economic impact towards the people, and just saying that, oh, they're going to create more jobs is a good thing, so we don't have to care about this, but this is a ridiculous amount of money. Also look to the fact that we're tearing up the roads with the hydraulic fracking, which is the equivalent of 1 to 3 million cars. These are huge economic impacts because we would have to pay for the damaged infrastructure, but even if you don't buy that, look at workers. They say that it's great because we're going to give more people jobs, but they're ignoring the fact that in 2 different studies, we see that these workers are more likely to have cancer and other skin-related diseases that could literally cause their death. It doesn't matter if you're getting more jobs if those jobs literally make people die. That's not a good impact for today's round. And the third thing is when they're talking about the oil. They admitted in their summary or their third speech, they talked about the fact that this is not a long-term solution for preventing ISIS. They said that it's not going to solve for ISIS. And additionally, they said the only people that are even buying oil from ISIS is from the black market, and they're not actually proving to you that hydraulic fracturing, like the oil that's coming from there, is actually going to stop the black market. They don't actually solve for this black market in any way. But then let's look at the environment, which is the most important thing in today's round. The only thing they literally talk about the environment is that EPA did one study over 4 years and found that it doesn't have any negative effects. Look to our numerous studies that show that there's drastic effects in multiple ways. First, look at earthquakes. We can see that in areas where hydraulic fracturing occurs, that there are more likely to have bigger earthquakes, which is going to affect a ton of people, damage infrastructure, and kill people. So if you're looking at economic impacts, the the impact of a giant earthquake is enormous. But then secondly, look to the fact that right now, hydraulic fracturing doesn't have to disclose what kind of gases or what kind of chemicals that they're actually using, showing that they could be literally putting anything into the earth. A temporary halt would make it more likely that we actually know what chemicals are being used and prevent certain toxic chemicals from actually being used in this process. Look to fish and wildlife. Literally nobody but us has talked about this. By using less chemicals and by having to actually disclose through a temporary halt, we're going to stop the degradation of wildlife and save more fish and other animals. Let's look to the fact that it's non-renewable. This is not a permanent solution. Realistically, they even admitted that this hydraulic fracturing is not going to be sustainable forever. Next, look to the fact that the chemicals, carcinogens and VOCs are vital organic compounds are actually being released in the atmosphere, and the fact that they don't actually extract all of the chemicals being used, showing that there is going to be drastic implications of this. So this one EPA study saying it's not that bad just is simply not true. And then finally look to oil spills. In North Dakota alone, there were 1,000 oil spills in 2011. So the fact that they're saying there is no environmental consequences is just simply untrue. They're looking at one study that clearly isn't taking into account what it means, and they don't even say what the EPA deems is a harm. They're not actually talking about oil spills, they're not talking about environmental impacts, because we can see that absolutely hydraulic fracturing has all of these. So because the world is a mirror of our attitudes and expectations, vote proposition.
Thanks, everyone.
Fracturing should be halted. So World Schools Debate is a little bit different than what you normally see when you see a debate. You don't just keep a flow as a judge for World Schools Debate. There's an actual point scoring system for World Schools Debate. So for each speech, debaters get points on content, style, and strategy. Content is the evidence that they're bringing to the debate. And as a judge, you are allowed to make decisions about whether or not that content is actually valid or true or should be weighed in the round. Style, they're speaking, which also includes the points of information that speakers give. So you might add or reduce a point from a previous speaker's score for a point of information that they stood for. And strategy, making choices about what's most important in that speech for the round. So this was a pretty close debate. The sides were fairly evenly matched on the content that they were bringing. We both felt the team opposition brought a little bit more content to today's debate. And I was scoring the debate on a spreadsheet, which I will share with all of your coaches. So according to my scores, team proposition wins by a very narrow margin, 254 to 250. So scores in World Schools Debate are going to be in that 230 to 300-ish range at the end of debate.
The only difference was where we put the emphasis on scoring. I agreed that team opposition had the better content, not as good delivery. I do think team opposition had a better structure for the framework and followed through. And I especially liked their emphasis upon the EPA and why that would show that the opposition was the correct position on the framework.
Yeah, and so that's one of the points where judges get to do a little bit of intervention on the idea of content. So team opposition was using this meta-analysis, and we as judges understand that a meta-analysis is a study of studies. Team proposition was relaying the meta-analysis as one little study. And so that cost them some points from me on my rubric because it's not one little study. It's a big, giant study of studies. But I didn't think that it was a large enough misinterpretation of what had been said on the part of team proposition to heavily dock them. One of the things that you did see today that doesn't normally happen in World Schools Debate competition is that the competitors were using laptops. World Schools Debate is an entirely paper debate, which makes it the only debate that doesn't use laptops anymore. However, as we're running World Schools Debate as a supplemental debate in local competition, laptops will be allowed because that's the only possible way that you're going to gather enough information to do the supplemental debate. And we don't want you to have to carry around lots and lots of paper that you're never ever going to end up using if you make it down rounds.